Thank you, and hello everyone. Greetings from Tallinn, Estonia. So I prepared a presentation. I hope it's visible.
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you very much. So so in this presentation, I'll give you a bit of an overview as was just introduced on what AI currently is meaning for governments and the various usage that we already identified, both my own research, but also as part of the expert advice I've been doing for the European Commission. So my name is Colin van Noordt. I am indeed doing a PhD in TalTech University. I really focus on the public value and the effects of AI in government. With all of its paradoxes and caveats, it's of course a very interesting and innovative field. So why are we doing this, right? So why so much interest in the use of artificial intelligence? Definitely the recent years, but I have a feeling that it has only given even more attention from policymakers this year. So there's a lot of interest for having AI, and especially then also growing interest of using AI for the government. That is different from the past, because in a couple of years ago, and even now still, governments are seen as this vital player for being, for helping the development of AI in their society, either as a facilitator by providing more data for companies to build machine learning models on, stimulating the startup scene, helping establish different kind of collaborations, providing funding, etc., or to as a regulatory role to make sure that there's framework conditions. But of course, governments are also a user of AI themselves, so they can help tackle various social challenges, and this is a role that is now becoming increasingly more important, as of course also there's links between government needs to know what AI can do, so to be more effective in facilitating and regulating. So as part of the research that I've been doing, so this is an overview of some of the cases that we identified in already last year's report on AI in public service, part of the AI Watch. So we found 230 different AI use cases across the EU. This is definitely not a complete view, as you can imagine, but this is just a sample of different cases that we could find or were submitted to the team. And from that, of course, we can find out some interesting points. So how AI, for example, is used. So what we could identify is that currently, that from the cases that we have, a large portion is used to provide in the general public services area. We do have a slight bias towards having more AI cases that are used by national administrations. 30 of the cases are part of the local level, but I have a feeling that in reality, local cities are doing much more than we could have found. Often we see a lot of chatbots, other forms of some kind of predictive analytics system, the use of computer vision or rule-based expert systems. What is also perhaps noteworthy is that despite the disruptive potential of this technology, we see that AI is often still very much used only as in a very incremental fashion. So it's only having slight changes to the way organizations work, and we have not really witnessed bigger changes in work practices, but of course, this may change in the future. And that is particularly because there are some challenges still in really moving from data analysis to the adoption of AI and really integrating it into work practices, and whether successful pilots and perhaps research projects really scale up. And this is one of the main barriers. So in that respect, there are some interesting examples, right? So I try to create, especially because of the workshop, is AI in policy making. So how is AI currently being used and may also be used in the future in more diverse ways than we can even imagine today? So at the moment, we see a lot of AI that's being used to help detect different social issues, either to make sure that it doesn't escalate, or to help policymakers to understand what is the general sentiment, or some of the local issues that they may have overlooked. So a nice example of this is a system used in Dublin City, which is called the Dublin Beat, and that gives, based on Twitter data, an overview of the different kind of issues that are being discussed on social media about the city, what is the sentiment, and it gives like a general overview every month for the city to base new policy on. So this is, of course, very helpful for policymakers to understand what is going on in the city. But of course, you've got to keep in mind that social media data is not fully representative of course, of all the issues. And there's definitely some barriers to using this data for many reasons. Alternatively, there's a growing use of AI to estimate potential effects of new policy. So you can compare ex ante what could be some of the effects, and you could change your policy accordingly. So this can either be economic effects, but also trying to understand potential citizen sentiment on some of the examples. So this new policy modeling is growing more and more advanced because of the use of AI. Alternatively, AI can also be used to improve the decision-making process within policy, mainly because of the previous stages, but also to, for example, have it easier to have citizens included within the policy-making process. So the Dublin Beat is one example where we see citizen input online gets more integrated into policymaking processes, but it can also expand even more, such as what we see in Citizen Lab, which is a private sector platform that many municipalities are using. And the AI can also help to analyze easier, to give more structure in all of the citizen input that they may have provided on the citizen participation platform, but also think on certain petitions or large public consultations. AI makes it much easier to aggregate all of these insights, and that make, of course, policy making perhaps more inclusive and more in line with citizen needs. Alternatively, AI can be used to monitor the ongoing implementation of policy, which we can see in Satikas. This is used in Estonia to monitor the grass mowing requirements in many agricultural subsidies. So it gives policymakers an overview of how the implementation of policy is going. Or alternatively, you can see an example in Amsterdam where they use object detection to also see how trash collection is going and where to adjust, for example, the routing of the garbage trucks. And of course, evaluation of policy is also very possible with new microdata and other forms of data sources to help understand if policy is actually a success or not. Alternatively, we see the creation of new public services. So the use of AI, like this robot used in Barcelona to help the elderly. So we're creating a really new kind of public service. It uses robots instead of people to help them care for themselves. Alternatively, we see the enhancement of information services. So this prevalent use of chatbots that many governments are using to help citizens find the information they need, or in this project, Bureaucrat in Estonia, where they really try to completely change the way citizens have to interact with governments. Rather than having to go to each of the office, they want to create one chatbot to connect all of the different databases of the government. So they can ask one question in one portal and they automatically get routed to the correct administration. Also, of course, redundant and perhaps tedious processes can get automated with AI, which leaves more time for experts to focus on more complex cases and to perhaps come up with new jobs that are much more value adding than checking forms, for example. Another example that I included is in Belgium, where they are already using AI technologies to help unemployed people find jobs that are close to their competences, and which only requires minor rescaling. So people can upload their CV and answer some questions, and they give an overview of jobs that are actually quite in line with their skills that they may not have realized before, and it can help them, of course, find a new job faster. Alternatively, we see a lot of uses for AI to improve the internal management of the public organization. So this is to either improving their own recruitment services, as this example in Sweden, where Tengai is actually a robot face to help the recruitment process. So instead of talking to a person, this robot assesses your competences and whether you're a suitable. Of course, this is still in collaboration with experts, but it plays an increasingly more bigger role. And it's argued to have this recruitment process less biased. So because the robot doesn't check how you look and how what kind of background you may have, but really just to see if you are suitable for the job. And that, of course, leads to a better inclusion of skills and diversity within public organizations. Alternatively, we see AI to help organizational resources be more used effectively, or that AI is used to improve the cybersecurity, such as in Estonia too, where the main data sharing platform also uses AI to detect anomalies in the cybersecurity, so they can be detected easier and addressed quicker as well. Alternatively, you see the use of AI to help public procurement processes themselves. So making tedious forms either be done automatically or checked automatically, or even predict whether a certain offer is likely to go over budget or not, based on all of the previous experiences on that exist in the database. And of course, a lot of uses of AI is used to help prevent fraud and corruption. So one of them here is the Veripon, Spain, also where they try to detect false police reports, because that's apparently a big issue in the police services there. And this system helps them to detect these false reports that can actually have big consequences, of course, for both the police time, but also for fraudulent investigations. So despite all this potential, right, so there's a lot of different uses, we still see that we are in a very preliminary state with the use of AI, because there's still quite a lot of different gaps and barriers that are present, limiting the use of AI in government, despite perhaps the readiness that governments have with regard to pre-existing digitalization. There's still many barriers, as one of these academic papers describe, that lies both in the technology implementation, the laws and regulation, the ethical concerns, which I will also highlight a bit later in this presentation, and the overall readiness of the society. And all of these factors, they limit the current deployment of AI in government, and they should also be taken into strong consideration by policymakers who are interested in going forward with AI, of course, because the ambition may be there, but many of these barriers may be overlooked and not given sufficient attention. And then in particular, I would like to stress that the technologies may be there, right? We have a lot of interesting projects or pilots, but if there's no use of AI in more active sense, there's also no value. That's always what I say: no use, no value of AI. And taking a strong consideration that what could be is not always what is. So organizations that may be tempted to use all these technologies because it is potentially very important and very beneficial, should also really take a close look at if this is also what really happens. So check all these barriers to innovation. And this is, for example, an overview that I found that from my own research that highlights all of the different factors that partially or greatly influence the AI-enabled innovation in the public sector. So, and this is, of course, data is one part of that, but there's many more different factors that really go beyond just the development of AI, and also really check like if this is use sustainable. because otherwise we run the risk of coming into an ever pilot, or that the technology is there, but people do not really use it into their daily practices. And that's also why digital transformation is not about technology, right? Innovation comes from people, and they have to use this into their own work. They have to integrate this into their normal work, and organizational practices have to change accordingly. And that is very difficult because this is an organizational change question, not so much technology, of course. So then, it's particularly for AI, there's a lot of different ethical challenges when governments start using these technologies, right? That go even beyond just the lack of funding or the lack of skills in the own organization. But there are serious risks that also, of course, have to be taken into strong consideration and mitigated as much as possible. Otherwise, the potential downsides of AI overshadow the potential benefits. So these is particularly related for policymaking and public services, that AI can lead to decisions being based on a black box, right? So we don't really know why the AI is recommending certain things. And this has very dire consequences for the accountability and trust in government if we cannot even explain why we take certain decisions. Of course, that directly translates to issues in liability, right? So when something bad happens because of AI's decision, who is to blame, and who should take responsibility? Likewise, AI uses a lot of data, and often even more sensitive than before, very, very detailed, that people may not always be aware of, that is being gathered for AI. Or we start using AI more and more, such as these examples with the object detection, that people may get frightened of, that there's so much more cameras and eyes and surveillance monitoring the policy. Of course, there's a lot of issues with bias from using historical data for policy making, because the data has been gathered in a certain context, and it can only amplify certain feedback loops that you maybe don't want to optimize. Cybersecurity that is used to, on the one hand, help public administrations. At the same time, it's also a risk of using AI because AI can be tricked, and there's many different ways to limit it. There's different power relations that change, right? So you need to be aware of that too. Existing social contracts between citizens and the state may change when AI starts becoming more and more used. And of course, there's serious consequences if governments get it wrong with these kind of technologies. So for the last slide, I would really like to stress, despite all the potential, keep in mind also the potential downsides, and be very reflective of AI. So public sectors have this user role, and it should be encouraged, that's for sure. But also keep in mind in your own organizations, do we have all of the factors there to really move forward with AI, and make sure that we get public value from AI. So not see AI just as the goal themselves, but check if citizens use it, and if the downstream it has a value, and it's not just a privacy monster, so to speak, but there's really a clear benefit associated. And if you get that, please make sure that it scales up within the organization and even outside of the organization, because all of the public administrations face similar issues, and they would really like to know what AI is successful and which is not. I thank you very much. I hope it was a very interesting presentation for you, and a nice Kickstarter for this great program that I already saw with all of these great speakers. So if you have any questions, please ask them now, because I unfortunately cannot join the whole workshop. Thank you.